Hello, welcome back to the channel and good morning. Today we're discussing social contract theory, how it relates to D&D, a brief history of how it started, and why you as a GM might want to care about it in your games. Believe it or not, this philosophical principle could help you to make your games way better and help your players to enjoy your games way more, and you're not going to want to miss that. Let's dive right in. Hello, you fine TTRPG people and D&D enthusiasts. Welcome back to the channel. I'm the GM Philosopher. Social contract theory is a philosophical concept that explores how individuals come together to form societies and establish governance through mutual agreements. It posits that people consent, either explicitly or implicitly, to surrendering some of their freedoms and submit to the authority of a governing body in exchange for protection of their remaining rights and the maintenance of social order. This theoretical contract forms the foundation of societal structures and legal systems. Now, after hearing this, you might have two very understandable questions. Number one is, GM Philosopher, where did social contract theory even come from? Why are you talking about this? And number two, why does it matter for D&D of all things? Like, what is the point? Well, I'm going to answer both those questions for you. So let's first start off with a very brief history of where social contract theory came from and sort of its development, and then how it ties into how it can actually help you to make your D&D games way better than you ever thought possible. Social contract theory really began with the work of a philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. In his work Leviathan in 1651, Hobbes argued that in a pre-social condition, the state of nature, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this chaos, individuals collectively agree to establish a sovereign authority with absolute power to maintain peace and security. Now, a philosopher named John Locke, in his 1689 work, Two Treatises of Government, presented a more optimistic view of mankind. He believed that people were rational and capable of self-government. The social contract for Locke exists to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property. If a government fails to protect these rights, the citizens have the right to overthrow it. Now, already we're coming up with a little bit of a picture of how this fits into D&D. Obviously, according to Thomas Hobbes, people will descend into kind of a brutish, barbaric state of being without some sort of governing body. Hence why you could argue, well, a GM is useful for filling that governing body role to help the game not descend into chaos and barbarism. With that being said, John Locke also made the case of saying, people are generally rational, and while they do believe in a governing body, they are rational enough that they will overthrow that governing body if it fails to protect their fundamental rights or to uphold the fundamental order of life or the status quo as needed in order for life to be good and to move forward in a positive, productive way. Hence, players may fire their GM or quit the game and join a different group. That's sort of like what we're looking at. Now, in 1762, a philosopher by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I hope I pronounced that correctly, I'm sorry, I've only read it, introduced the idea that sovereignty lies with the people. He emphasized the general will, suggesting that laws should reflect the collective interests of the populace. The social contract is an agreement among free individuals to create a society that benefits all. And really, this third iteration of the social contract theory basically tells us that what the GM, in a D&D sense, should care about as the governing body is actually what the people desire. So this means what the players want. And so the players' desires actually form the basis for what should be considered proper governance. In Dungeons & Dragons, the game is a collective storytelling experience requiring trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding between the game master and the players. Applying social contract theory to D&D helps establish clear expectations and fosters a healthy gaming environment. It ensures that both the GM and the players are working toward a common goal, an enjoyable and engaging game. And this is why both the governing body, the GM, and the players and the will of the players is all needed to create an actual social contract where players will actually feel at peace, at ease, and like their goals can progress forward, and that where they can trust the governing body, the GM, to adjudicate effectively and to maintain the status quo desired for a successful game. Interestingly, this is actually hinted at and sort of outlined in detail in Chapter 1, Playing the Game, on page 7 of the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook. It says, if you want to be the mastermind of the game and you want to be the DM, here's what DMs do. It's basically a description of what they do. They build adventures. They prepare adventures that the players experience. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, you'll find advice for how to create adventures and even whole worlds. They guide the story. You narrate much of the action during play, describing locations and creatures that the adventurers face. The players decide what their characters do as they navigate hazards and choose what to explore. Then you use a combination of imagination and the game's rules to determine the results of the adventurers' decisions. And then finally, you adjudicate the rules. You oversee how the group uses the game's rules, making sure the rules serve for the group's fun. You'll want to read the rest of this chapter to understand those rules, and you'll find the rules glossary essential. So even in the Player's Handbook, in the very beginning of Chapter 1, they outline these responsibilities of the GM, and it's clear to see why they do this. It's because there has to be a valid and working social contract that is not just existing, but that is also mutually desirable and, to a very great degree, agreed upon ahead of time. Without this social contract, your game is doomed, most likely, to fall into a situation where players and GMs have different goals and different visions and desires for the game. And a lot of times this leads to disconnection, a lack of immersion, and players just in general not enjoying it, and the GM probably getting frustrated and feeling like, what the heck, no one likes my game, this sucks. So this leads us to a very important question. How can you use social contract principles to enhance your D&D game, prevent it from falling apart, prevent players from feeling disconnected, and in general be a more successful GM who run games that players will line up to want to play, instead of a GM who can't get players to sit through 3 sessions without throwing up their hands and saying, screw you, you suck at being a GM, we're going to go play with someone else? Well, this is a good question, and I actually have 9 different points that I want to run through really quick that explain exactly how to use the most important social contract principles that should be applied to D&D in literal game setting scenarios. So let's go through them really quick. First of all, establish mutual agreements. The principle here is, like individuals forming a society, GMs and players should agree on the rules and expectations of the game. You can conduct a session 0 to discuss game mechanics, house rules, campaign themes, and content boundaries. Use the session to co-create the game's social contract. This is the application. Some examples could be at session 0, your group could agree on the campaign setting, character creation rules, and establishing boundaries. For example, maybe no player versus player combat, no evil characters, etc. You can also discuss content boundaries. During session 0, the group could decide to avoid themes like extreme gore or personal phobias so that everyone stays comfortable and no one gets like triggered and has an unfun experience. Principle number 2 is balancing authority and freedom. The principle here is that social contracts balance individual freedoms with the authority needed to maintain order. And the application is this. The GM sets the game's framework, but allows the players freedom to make choices that affect the narrative. Good GMs will empower players to make meaningful decisions that impact the story in a fun way. Some examples of this could include adapting to player choices. While the GM prepares the overarching plot, they should adapt the story based on players' decisions, such as pursuing unexpected quest lines. Player agency is also important here. If players decide to ally with an unexpected faction or to team up with an unexpected bad guy, the GM should adjust the storyline to accommodate their choice, focusing more on the players and the collaborative storytelling element than their original plotline. And this balances that authority and the freedom. Principle number 3 is one that I think is actually really important, and I take this very seriously in my games, or at least I strive to. The principle here is protecting player rights. According to Locke, governments must protect the rights of individuals. The application here for D&D is that the GM should ensure that every player has the opportunity to contribute and that their character's agency is respected. Apply game rules consistently to maintain trust and let players have the freedom to act within those boundaries. Some examples of this include acknowledging creativity, or maybe the rule of cool. Avoid overshadowing a player's choices. If a player devises a creative solution, you can acknowledge and incorporate it, right? And then fair rule enforcement. If a rule applies to one player, it should apply to all, not just, you counted for the least favorite players, but you'll let your favorite ones slide by. It's obviously not fair and it's not fun. This can include NPCs and adversaries. This is really important. Letting your bad guys get away with things that your good guys can't feels unfair and kind of dirty. It's probably going to make your game feel less fun. This ensures fairness and respect for player rights. And that leads us to principle number 4, promote the general goodwill. The principle here is that Rousseau's concept emphasizes the collective good over individual desires. Or as they would say in Star Trek, the rules of the many outweigh the needs of the few or of the one. The application for D&D here is that you can encourage decisions that enhance the group's enjoyment, sometimes requiring compromise from individual players and from yourself. Address any actions that consistently disrupt the group's fun to realign with collective expectations. Some examples of this that could come right from D&D include group harmony. If one player's actions are causing conflicts or detracting from others' enjoyment, the GM can facilitate a discussion to address the issue and promote group cohesion. So if you have a player who keeps spitting their sunflower seeds at the other players and they all find this annoying, you can ask them politely to stop to restore the harmony. Collaborative storytelling is another thing here. Invite players to contribute to world building, fostering a sense of shared investment in the game that aligns with the group's interest. I especially think this is super cool when you allow players to make assumptions about their characters' backstories, and then you write those backstories into your story as canon. This, I think, is very respectful and is a great way to include them in that process, and it does promote the general goodwill of the group. Principle number 5 is maintain open communication. The principle here is that a social contract relies on ongoing consent and dialogue. The application for D&D is that you can foster an environment where players feel comfortable providing feedback, implement regular opportunities for feedback, and make adjustments as needed. Okay, so some examples of this in real life D&D games could be feedback loops. After each session or after each arc or whatever, you could spend a few minutes discussing what everyone enjoyed and what could be improved. You can also check in regularly with players about the game's direction and pacing, ensuring everyone is satisfied with how the game is progressing. As a GM, you want to be open to adaptation and evolution to make your game better, and this is different with every group of players because every group of players is a little bit different. The 6th point here is to address conflicts fairly. The principle here is that in society, breaches of the social contract are addressed through justice systems. The application for D&D is that you can establish clear protocols for resolving in-game and out-of-game conflicts. You can agree on how disputes will be handled before they arise, basically. Some examples of this include conflict resolution mechanisms, like you can agree that any disputes over rules will be briefly discussed, and if unresolved, the GM's ruling stands for the session with further review later. You can also address private concerns. You can create a system where players can voice concerns privately, and issues are mediated respectfully to maintain group harmony. For example, at my table, I basically have a system where if someone does something that is like, I think, hurting group cohesion, I will always speak to them in private very politely and just kind of bring it up. And like, if I can handle it in private without like embarrassing them, like calling them out at the table, I would much, much rather do that. And this 99% of the time always eliminates any issues before anyone else really knows that they've been handled. And so this is just one example of how at my table I handle these types of things. And this leads us to number 7, transparency in governance. So the principle here is that trust and authority comes from transparency and fairness. The application for D&D being be open about rules, decisions, and any changes in the game's mechanics that you plan to observe. Explain the purpose of new house rules and invite feedback for them. Players must understand where the boundaries are. And if they don't, they might get confused and frustrated, and for good reason, because they'll expect a certain kind of outcome based on what they thought the parameters were. This is sort of like getting a ticket for speeding when you did not realize there was a speed limit. It doesn't give you an excuse to break the rules per se, but it is way more frustrating than getting a ticket for speeding when you knew that you were speeding and you were taking the risk knowingly, right? Now, some examples of how this could apply to a D&D game are explaining changes. If you introduce a new house rule, such as modifying spellcasting mechanics, you can explain why and how it benefits the game, inviting player input. You can also consistently ensure that all players understand the rules and that they are applied consistently to avoid confusion and feelings of favoritism, which we've kind of already covered a little bit. And this leads us to number 8, consent and autonomy. Now, the principle here is that individuals must consent to the social contract. Coercion undermines its legitimacy. This is why in a democratic republic, you have people vote to elect people, and then hopefully people get elected who the voting base trust to help vote on laws that will then get passed, right? We don't have like a dictator enforcing all the rules at a whim. Everyone is supposed to get kind of a say. And even though in a really big democratic republic, it often doesn't feel like you get a say, the principle is that getting a say is really important, and coercion undermines legitimacy, and it just makes it more sketchy. So the application for D&D here is never force players into uncomfortable situations, obtain consent for sensitive content, use inclusivity and safety tools like the X card or lines and veils. Some examples of this could include content consent. Before including horror elements or mature themes, ask if everyone is comfortable with this genre. We talked about going over these things in session 0. And then you can use safety tools. If a scene crosses a player's comfort threshold, they can signal it using like an X card. You can hand us some cards with X's on it, and they can hold it up if they're like, whoa, 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 just put on the brakes, GM. This is making me feel weird. I don't like this. So that's just some ideas that, you could use as a GM to help give people a choice without making it difficult and without making them feel like they don't have a say. And this leads us to the final point, number 9, respecting time and commitment. The principle here is that mutual respect strengthens the social contract and ensures cooperation. And the application for D&D is you want to acknowledge everyone's investment in the game by respecting schedules and commitments. For me as a GM, this is actually really important. And I think that this is something that far too many people let go lax in their groups, to be really honest. Some examples of this include one word that I think is so important, punctuality. Set a consistent schedule and honor start and end times, showing respect for everyone's availability. And then preparation. Both the GM and the players should come prepared to sessions, demonstrating commitment to the group's shared experience. And I think, to be really honest, that this is even more important for the GM, because the GM is the one who has been trusted as the governing body for the group. And if the GM does not come prepared, the game will likely suffer more than if an individual player doesn't come prepared. This doesn't mean that I think players shouldn't come prepared. I would love it if players always came prepared, but I do understand a lot more if a player kind of shows up and they're rushed because they just got off work and maybe they have a busy life. I want to be so prepared that I can kind of help make up for their lack of preparation. And that's just my theory and the way that I try to operate as a GM. This doesn't mean that I'm always perfectly prepared, but I do try to do the very best that I can. With that being said, I do have a couple things to offer you that might be helpful when talking about this. If you struggle with creating plot arcs, and plot arcs are necessary for creating awesome games and awesome content for your players, you can download my Ultimate Plot Randomizer. Using 4 handy D100 tables, you can random roll the hook, the conflict, the conclusion, and wild, wacky stuff to add to any of your plot arcs. If the players do unexpected things and you want to give them that player agency that they deserve within the boundaries of the rules, guess what? Roll up some new plot arcs and you can be off and running with no problem at all. Sprinkle a little of your own creativity on it and it'll be awesome. The link is in the description. If you sign up for my email list, this ebook comes free with your first email. So you're not going to want to miss that. You're going to want to grab that. Secondly, I also want to encourage you to join my Discord group. It is free. There are awesome TTRPG enthusiasts in there, D&D enthusiasts, GMs, players. We run games in there. We discuss things like homebrew rules. We discuss things like GM style, all kinds of cool stuff. If you love D&D or TTRPGs and you like Discord, you're definitely going to want to at least stop by and say hi. With that being said, that's going to be a wrap. It's going to conclude my thoughts on how social contract theory relates to D&D. I hope that you found this helpful. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. What's your opinion on this? And thank you so much for coming by and watching another one of my videos. I'm here almost every day creating videos about the best game in the world, D&D. So I will see you awesome people on the next one.